Oh, okay. There you go.
All right, I think we're good. And we're back with episode 359 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be continuing our Young Critics Watch Old Movie series with 1929's Diary of a Lost Girl. And joining me today is our guest, Thomas Gladysz. Thomas is the founder and director of the Louise Brooks Society. And Thomas, thank you so much for joining us for the episode.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So
wherever here is in cyberspace.
Exactly. Here in whatever podcast app or audio device you're listening to this with.
Yes.
Before we jump into the discussion on Diary of a Lost Girl, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Louise Brooks Society. Tell me a little bit about what y'all do and what programming and such that you all have done recently.
Well, it's a group. It's a website that I actually started 26 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I put it up in 1995 because just before that, I had seen Louise Brooks in Pandora's Box. And it was just a chance encounter, you might say, because I went to the video store one night, back when we used to have video stores, and I rented Pandora's Box, just thought, oh, this looks kind of maybe interesting. So I took it home and watched it, and I was just blown away. I just had never seen anything like it before. I didn't really know anything about Louise Brooks. I had seen a few German films from the time, but I was just really stunned. So, I got up the next morning and watched it all over again because it was I had to see it again. And plus I had to return the video, the next day.
Sure.
But, so I was just like wowed by seeing her in Pandora's Box. So, I talked to people at work about this film that I had seen over the weekend, and asked friends, film buffs, hey, have you ever heard about this? Do you know anything? And people were kind of vague. They didn't really know too much about her. And so, I looked for books at the library, looked for other videos to rent, and it became this quest. And this was in the early 1990s. And just when the internet and the World Wide Web was starting. So in 1995, I launched my website, the Louise Brooks Society, to try to connect with other people in the world to see if they shared my enthusiasm, to see what they knew about Louise Brooks and Pandora's Box and the world of silent film. So I launched the website, and it's been going ever since. And it was a way to, reach out to other film buffs, other film historians, enthusiasts, individuals. And, over time, I've heard from her family members. I've heard from actors and actresses and famous writers and all kinds of people who share my enthusiasm, rock musicians. It's pretty amazing what a following she has. And so Louise Brooks Society has been going since 1995, and it's a website, it's an online archive, and it's sort of a fan club. And over that time, I've done 4 books on her. I have another one in the works, a 2-volume work that should be out later this year, hopefully. I've introduced her films. I've curated exhibits about her. I've lectured about her. I've written articles about her. I'm a sort of a one-man band enthusiast about Louise Brooks.
Yeah. Well, it clearly seems like that there is that interest, though. I mean, for you, when you're hearing from all of these people, not just family members, but people just outside of Brooks's family, that clearly she made an impact on them. I mean, what about her as an actress and a persona do you feel like attracted so much attention from so many people?
That's a really good question, and it's one I've been thinking about since 1995. She's a kind of an interesting story, and her career is an interesting story. She achieved a great deal of fame in the 1920s, and then it all kind of came crashing down. And she was out of film by 1938 and fallen into obscurity, and people thought she was dead for a while because no one knew anything about her anymore. And then she kind of got rediscovered in the 50s and 60s, and she started writing for magazines like Sight and Sound and Positif. And then she kind of got rediscovered by the greater film community, not just film historians who maybe had an interest in the silent era. And then she kind of moved into, mainstream culture, and to the point where I think now she's kind of just considered a 20th century icon. And ever since the 80s or the 70s, she pops up in movie after movie. There's Something Wild with Melanie Griffith, where Melanie Griffith's character plays Lulu. And it's, and there's so many other films that where you see her image. She's constantly being evoked by other filmmakers. And it's because I think the film community, filmmakers, film historians, but also fans just really relate to her on-screen image and also her story. There's a really tremendous biography of her by Barry Paris that, he's really empathetic towards her rise and fall and rise again. It's a book I would highly recommend. So.
Yeah. Well, I know that's something, just her star persona, like you say. I think that's probably what, because we did Pandora's Box here on Cinematary a few years ago. And I think that's kind of the thing that we thought of most with that is, one, it kind of has this queer subtext, and that was something that interested us. But also, we didn't know much about Louise Brooks. We just knew that she kind of was, I think a face in the same realm as like, Marilyn Monroe and Judy Garland, and people who you may not know extensively about their career, but like that face, what they look like on screen. And so she has this career in Hollywood, but then she ends up in Berlin and Germany doing Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl. What I think, to me, it's kind of interesting that she took that path, because you have so many German actresses like Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich who came from Germany to America. Why did she kind of go almost the opposite path and have to end up there and end up teaming up for these two movies with G.W. Pabst?
Well, it was kind of on a lark. I mean, it's never anything planned. She's at a point in her career in late 1928 or mid 1928, where her contract was up with Paramount. She wanted to be paid more because she felt like she was on the rise as an actress. They didn't want to pay her more. And she heard about this interest from G.W. Pabst in Germany. She didn't know anything about Pabst. She didn't know anything about the Lulu plays. But hey, there's this German filmmaker. He's supposed to be kind of good, and he's interested in you. So she, said, so long, Paramount, which was a gutsy thing to do because they're one of the biggest studios. They were one of the biggest studios in the world. And so she left to make Pandora's Box. And so it was never anything intentional. She just went there, and I think she blossomed as an actress. She had done a good number of films in the United States, starting in 1925 through 1928. And there's some good films there. Beggars of Life is a great film. That's one she did with William Wellman. But when she went to Germany, she blossomed as an actress, and Pabst was well known as a director who could cultivate great actresses. He had worked with Garbo in Joyless Street. He worked with Leni Riefenstahl. He worked with Brigitte Helm, a number of actresses who he really sort of made them shine. And so, he worked wonders with Louise Brooks in Pandora's Box. And then she came back to the States, and then she returned to France because she was going to make a film in France called Prix de Beauté that was scripted by G.W. Pabst and René Clair. But then that project kind of fell apart, and Pabst called her back to Germany, and she made Diary of a Lost Girl. And then eventually she returned to France to make Prix de Beauté. It was René Clair dropped out, and this Italian director who was working in France, Augusto Giannini, ended up directing it. It's a really good film as well. And if your listeners out there have seen Pandora's Box and have seen Diary of a Lost Girl and like them, then they should definitely see Prix de Beauté, because you could almost say it's a loose trilogy, because Louise Brooks is in all films. All three of them are tragedies. The worst things in the world befall her. So they all kind of belong together.
Yeah.
And that was the high point of her career, was working in Europe.
Yeah, it seemed like, just from cursory research, that she really thrived there, and then it seems like she would go home, and the opportunities in Hollywood were less.
Yeah, they all dried up because she had walked away from Paramount, and when she returned in 1930, she was kind of blacklisted. She was seen as being difficult to work with. And the scuttlebutt out there was that her voice did not record well, because this was right when silent films were coming in and really talkies were coming in and taking over. So she struggled. She made 3 sort of middling, poor films in 1931, and then she dropped out again for another 5 years, and she made a Western in 1936 and a couple of films that you can't even find her in 1937. Actually, one of them she was cut out of, a film directed by Robert Florey. And then she made a Western with John Wayne in 1938, and that's it. And she hung out in Hollywood for another year or two, and then decided, I'm going back home. And then she took off and left, and that was it. So in some ways, Louise Brooks is a very problematic character in film, or actor in film history, because when people know of her or think of her, they think of Pandora's Box and Lulu. And she's really more than just a one-hit wonder, because I think her 3 European films are all pretty good. I think the 2 Pabst films are masterpieces. But there's more to her than just Pandora's Box and Lulu. She had a relatively brief career. She was in relatively few films. So, there's maybe not a lot to think about in terms of her. Other people who have been in so many more films, or maybe achieved more. As someone once said about her, there are no other actresses who are so famous and have done so few films.
Yeah, I mean, she has such a getting into the film, she has such a striking presence both in this and in Pandora, where you immediately are kind of drawn to just her presence. She just has this presence. For you, revisiting the film last night, what in Diary of a Lost Girl kind of sticks out to you most about the way that she portrays this character in this film?
Well, she really inhabits the character. And I don't know, I think that comes from 2 forces. One of them is Pabst's ability to draw out of her all of the sort of suffering and injustice that the character suffers. She really inhabits her character. But the fact that she herself was a victim of sexual abuse when she was a girl, a young girl, and then here she is playing a victim of sexual abuse once again for the 3rd time, at least in her career, is kind of striking. And she said that she never knew what this film was about when she was making it, and she never watched her films when she was making them. Only later like in the 50s or 60s, did she watch Diary of a Lost Girl and sort of come to terms with what it's really about, which is, social injustice and so I think the fact that she had experience with sexual abuse and with, Pabst is really drawing on those issues around gender and social injustices, and Louise Brooks is a great fit. So
Yeah. Well, that was something that definitely kind of stuck out to me with both films is, and knowing Pabst, the other of his films that I've seen is The Joyless Street, which is also very ingrained in kind of what we're talking about. And so that's why, when thinking about why she would want to go to Germany, finding work is always good and getting paid. But
right.
I wonder if also, just cinema in general in the Weimar era that they clearly were kind of engaged with a lot of these issues, whether it was poverty and gender and sexual issues, and it seemed like something that a lot of filmmakers, not just Pabst, but Murnau and Land, a lot of these folks were really engaged in kind of exploring that. And I wondered if that was something that was important to her. That's why
I
she wanted
don't
to go.
think so. I don't think we can attribute those interests to her. I think she went on a lark, really, by chance. The great German films from the times are ones that addressed important issues, and those are the ones we remember today. Certainly, there were frivolous, silly films in Germany being made at the time that no one pays attention to anymore.
Yeah.
But I think I just don't think that we can really attribute any kind of motivation for her to going to Germany besides she got a job offer, and she wanted to get away from the United States and Paramount and sort of leave her life behind, at least for a short time, to go work somewhere else. And she was kind of a pioneer in that. I won't say that she was the very first actress to ever do that. I don't think she was, but she was perhaps one of the most significant actresses of her time to go to Europe to work, and being one of the first ones to do it. I know Anna May Wong, a major Asian American star, went to Europe and made some films. And then, there's a whole bunch of Europeans that came to the United States besides Garbo and Dietrich. There's Pola Negri and many others. But, that's during the silent era. Film was a lot more international than we might think, because there wasn't the language barrier. Once talkies came in, obviously, the actors and actresses with the heavy accents had problems.
Sure.
And that sort of issue surfaces in the next film that Louise Brooks made after Diary, which is Prix de Beauté, where it was a French production, but she didn't speak French and she didn't bother to learn it, so she had to be dubbed in the versions, in the French version that was made. Actually, Prix de Beauté is an interesting story because it was one of the very first French sound films, but it was released as both a silent and a sound film, like a lot of films were on the cusp of the change in the industry. And the other interesting thing about Prix de Beauté, it was made in 4 different languages. It was made in French, German, Italian, and English. And so they had to have actors and actresses, or actors, and actresses dub all 4 different versions. But actually, since there's also the French, Italian, German, and English silent versions, so there's actually 8 different versions of that film. Kind of an oddity.
Yeah, I guess kind of that international market, getting it out there to different places and different,
Right.
film movements it was kind of something to think about. It's interesting that you bring up that she she kind of was able to transcend internationally, because that was something that it's quick to learn when you learn about silent movies. That's why everybody knew who Charlie Chaplin was, people
Right.
like that, because the movies are silent. They can kind of play for whatever. And so I wonder, maybe that's kind of somewhat of an answer to the first, an early question of why is Louise Brooks so so popular and recognized, is maybe because of that international, just the way that silent movies kind of move.
This is true, and also it's also a truism that Louise Brooks is far more popular overseas back in the 20s and 30s and today.
Mm-hmm.
I think she is more popular in France and in Germany and elsewhere, back then than she ever was back in the United States. There was almost in France, kind of like there was this cult about Jerry Lewis in France in the 60s or whatever. There was almost that kind of appreciation for Louise Brooks in France as well. One of her films, Diary of a Lost Girl, when it showed in Paris, when it first showed there, it played continuously for a couple months, which was unprecedented. Back then, a new film would open up, and it would show for a week, and then it would go. A lot of the films that we would have heard of from the era showed for a week. Maybe if they were extremely popular, like a Chaplin or a Douglas Fairbanks, or maybe a Valentino film, they might show for 2 or 3 weeks, but or even longer. But Diary of a Lost Girl was a huge hit in Paris, probably more than it was in Germany. And then even one of her earlier films, A Girl in Every Port, which was directed by Howard Hawks, a film she made in the States, and it was released in 1928. When that film played in Paris, it was probably the most popular of all of her films, both American and European. It showed continuously for 6 months, which is incredible for the silent era. And a lot of the articles that you'll read in French newspapers and magazines about Diary of a Lost Girl or Pandora's Box will say, oh, the star of A Girl in Every Port is in this film. That's how much of a touchstone it was for viewers back then. So Louise Brooks's reputation is an interesting issue to deal with. And actually, a book that I'm working on right now, that I hope to have finished by the end of the year, is it's called Around the World with Louise Brooks. And it looks at her career, tells the story of her career all through international sources. And there's a lot of revelations there about her. For example, with Diary of a Lost Girl. In 1932, a French newspaper put together a poll of the greatest films of all time. This is only in 1932, so and a couple of Louise Brooks's films made the list. One of them was Diary of a Lost Girl. Pandora's Box was not there. People at the time in Paris and in France thought that Diary of a Lost Girl was a far better film than Pandora's Box. The other film, of course, was A Girl in Every Port. There's other interesting things, like in 1929, the leading Japanese film magazine, which was called Movie Times, they put out their annual best of lists, and the third best foreign film of the year was Beggars of Life. There's her films got a lot of recognition. She was more than just that one-hit wonder, than we think of, that some people might think of her today. People really, especially Europeans, really thought highly of Louise Brooks, and also so did the Japanese. There was almost a cult around actors and actresses like Clara Bow and Louise Brooks in Japan in the 1920s and early 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
It's film history kind of tells a different story about her. So.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned in that French publication that Diary is kind of viewed, at least at that period of time, as like a superior film to Pandora's Box. Researching that, did you find like kind of what attracted audiences to that one over Pandora's Box, or was there just kind of we just felt like that one was better?
I think they thought it held together as a film better.
Mm-hmm.
I think they thought that Louise Brooks's character in the film was maybe more sympathetic.
Mm-hmm.
Critic after critic said how much they admired her acting in Diary of a Lost Girl.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with Diary of a Lost Girl and with Pandora's Box is how heavily they were censored.
Mm-hmm.
And not only when Diary of a Lost Girl came out in Germany, within a couple of months, it had been withdrawn from circulation in order to be recut because the German censors had so many problems with the film. And as the film moved around the world, it would often be censored according to the standards of whatever country it was. I'm sure it was cut in France and it was cut everywhere else. And in a lot of the articles about that I've come across about Diary of a Lost Girl and Pandora's Box, the critics will often complain about, these scenes don't make sense. Something seems to be missing. That we know that the censors have cut these films.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see today on DVD is not complete. There was even a famous anecdote by the screenwriter of Diary of a Lost Girl, who said that he was in Paris at the time and had seen Diary of a Lost Girl, and the film ended. And he thought, well, maybe the film broke. What's going on? The story's not even over with yet. But actually, the film was done.
Mm-hmm.
They just sort of like chopped off the ending, and he was like, what's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And that was a lot of people expressed their frustration at the state of the film, knowing that it had been censored back then. And so what we see today is incomplete. I hope that you saw the Kino DVD when you saw the film, because that's probably the best version out there.
I would assume so. I think, because I remember watching it. I think it was either through Kino's site or Criterion. So I would assume that would be the version. I remember, it's funny because we're talking about this one in this year's series, as well as Mädchen in Uniform, and it was very funny a couple of years ago when we watched Pandora's Box, because because of the kind of queer subtext in it. I think that's something that we were kind of looking forward to seeing that type of content like in a silent era movie. And I remember the discussion on the episode around it being like, honestly, there wasn't enough lesbian stuff, there wasn't enough, but at the same time, as we learn more about, that film, as well as the other two films I mentioned, that censorship, especially with American versions, US versions, was very prevalent, it seemed.
Yeah. I mean, they were heavily censored in Europe, where you might think things were a little more liberal, or things were, Weimar Germany, oh man, they were decadent, and everybody was partying all the time.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of complaints about the two Pabst films at the time. And the other thing to know that your viewers may not know is, both of the Pabst Louise Brooks films were released right during the transition from silent to sound.
Mm-hmm.
And as well as Prix de Beauté, her next French film. But they never showed in the United States. Well, Pandora's Box was shown in New York City in late 1929. And then there's a few hit and miss showings around the United States in the 1930s, where it kind of showed as either an exploitation film or it showed in art houses, or, it didn't really have much of a run besides a couple of weeks in New York City in late 29. So people hardly even knew it was there. Diary of a Lost Girl never showed in the United States until the late 1950s. And those were like at the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York. It didn't even have a theatrical release until the 70s or 80s. So, and Prix de Beauté never made it here until I think the early 60s. So, the work that Louise Brooks did, which is certainly the best work of her career, the critics in the United States hardly even were aware that she had made films. Certainly film viewers never, you can't say they were even aware of these films. They got very little press. They might have gotten a review in Variety or something else. And when, Pandora's Box showed in New York City, it was reviewed in the New York City newspapers, but then that's about it. It's as almost, to her American fans, I would think that it was almost as if she had dropped, off the screen and where is she these days, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, what was the kind of impetus for that? Was it from her writing that you had mentioned that she had been doing, or was there just kind of a revival of interest in her as an actress?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
When the films kind of came in the 50s and this,
Right.
the 50s and 70s and started being shown, what was there a reason why? Was there something like a specific moment that kind of triggered that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, there was. She was, so after she dropped out of film, she went back home for a couple of years in Wichita, Kansas. And then she returned to New York City, which is really her spiritual home. And she was, living kind of almost hand to mouth, something of a barfly, a loner, in New York City in some small apartment. And she stayed there until the late 1950s. So this is the early 40s, the late 50s. She was just like Nowheresville, and kind of forgotten. I mean, if you look at the film histories of the time, practically no one mentions her. And then in the late 50s, the director, the film curator, I should say, for the George Eastman Museum, a fellow named James Card, was talking to a film publicist saying, God, do you remember that old actress, Louise Brooks? Boy, I'd like to find out whatever happened to her. And the film publicist, the guy by the name of John Springer, he said, I know where she is. She lives in the same apartment building I live in New York City. So James Card, the film curator, wrote her a letter saying, would like to meet with you, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, they struck up a friendship, and eventually Louise Brooks relocated from New York City to Rochester, New York, to be near the George Eastman Museum, which is a great film museum. And the film historians and the film community around the George Eastman house kind of gathered around Brooks and helped her get her shit together, basically. And she started, have you ever seen your own films? And so they got her to watch her own films. She was a wonderful letter writer, so they knew that she could write. And she started, they encouraged her to be writing her memoirs and write essays about film and all the people that she had known and worked with. And so she started writing articles for Sight and Sound, Positif, Objectif, all the great European film magazines. And people were like, oh yeah, Louise Brooks, I remember her. And so then, James Card started reviving. He had a couple of prints he had a print of Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl and maybe Beggars of Life and a couple others. And he started showing them or taking them around the country, showing them at film festivals. and her reputation started emerging again, along with all of the articles that she did for film magazines that really sparked people's interest. And film historians from the time, and archivists and curators, Henry Langlois, the founder of the French Cinémathèque, put on a big retrospective of her films, invited her to Europe to, be like the star of all this. And, it all kind of took off from there. So.
Yeah, that's why, I'm interested, because it seemed like, as we've talked about, she didn't have necessarily the acclaim, or at least the recognition in her day. And so I wasn't sure if, like, it was these one of these films specifically that kind of sparked that interest, or just kind of, it seemed, as you're describing it, it seemed like just her career at large really was something that kind of became more inspiring to film historians as it went along.
Well, the first film that people during the revival picked up on was Pandora's Box.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything sort of hinged on that, because it is a pretty daring film for its time. And even today, it's like, it's sort of some hot topic stuff there,
Absolutely.
So it was, but also back in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, films cannot be seen on demand. So how does a film historian know anything about her? Because you can't necessarily see her films. It's maybe a few references in a book or something.
Sure.
Or some pictures. So, it was a whole different world in terms of film history back then. But, reputations rise and fall. And a lot of her contemporaries in the 20s are not very well remembered, people who are much more famous than she was. Tastes change as well. But in terms of the revival, I would say she was in the right place at the right time in terms of being surrounded by film historians who were enamored of her. She I think she's a really great actress, but I think her genius is her personality.
Yeah, and that's, I think, to add to that is that she's able to exude that, like, in the films. You feel that personality, you feel that, like, she feels very singular in both of these movies. And I think that's a lot of the reason why we're talking about them in a series like this, where we're looking at the canonical history of cinema.
Right.
Not to this might be a Sophie's choice for you, and so you don't have to make a hard decision, but as we kind of wrap up, I'm curious, is Pandora's Box still the one that you would probably recommend the people who are kind of interested in learning more about her, or do you have do you appreciate Diary of a Lost Girl as well?
Good question. I would say, Pandora's Box is a great film. I've seen it at least a dozen times. I think Diary of a Lost Girl is maybe the better film. The films, as similar as they are also very different. And I think Diary of a Lost Girl is if a viewer today wanted to watch one film to start with, I would say Diary of a Lost Girl. Because I think viewers today can relate to it a lot more. It tells a really pretty contemporary kind of story, so yeah, I would say Diary of a Lost Girl. But also, if you want to watch one of her American films, go with Beggars of Life. It's out on DVD from Kino as well. It's also a really tremendous film. She kills her abusive stepfather and goes on the run dressed up like a boy amongst hobos on the run. That's like, whoa, okay. And back in the 20s when this film was showing, no one had a problem with that. It's like, yeah, that's a pretty cute boy there dressed up and running around with hobos, So yeah, I would say Beggars of Life, Diary of a Lost Girl are both excellent introductions to Louise Brooks.
Yeah, it's definitely, revisiting this and researching for the film has definitely made me want to revisit Pandora's Box, because it's been a couple of years since I'd seen it. But I after seeing Diary for the first time, for this episode, I think I have to kind of settle with that as well, because there's just something, between her character and the Count character, who's her friend, and just the familial dynamics between her and the stepmom and her father, and later her younger sister. There's just a lot of different elements in that film that are really engaging for audiences.
And those the head of the girls' school, the reformatory, the big bald guy, and then the little sadistic they're a husband and wife, if you can believe it.
Yeah,
they're also brilliant. The way they, I don't know, just they're so creepy and weird. And then the seducer, Meinhardt, is another, brilliantly done, but what a creepy guy. And he was just like, ew. But again, it was all pretty sensitively done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a beautiful film. The one thing I really want to also talk about a little bit
Definitely
is the book that was the inspiration for Diary of a Lost Girl.
Yeah,
was the book that the film was based on, and actually Pabst, the version of Diary of a Lost Girl, was the third film version of it. There was 2 of them made previously, and the book was published in 1905 and was a huge sensation. And it remained in print until the early 1930s, when the Nazis, groups allied with the Nazis, drove it out of print, because again, they were attacking the book.
Yeah.
Because of the story that it tells. And the story that the book tells is the story that Pabst tells, which is really, about the social injustice and pointing a finger at how poorly women, and young women especially, were treated at the time. But it's a fascinating story behind Diary of a Lost Girl. Where is it? Right there. When the book was published in 1905, it was said to be the real diary of a teenager who fell into prostitution. And to her dying day, the author of the book never said that she was the author. She always said she was just the editor of this manuscript of a young girl's diary. But of course, it really wasn't. It was a fake diary. But she never admitted it, and there was controversy over it, and it was a huge sensation. And a lot of people believed it was a real diary, to the degree that fans of the book wrote to the editor, Margaret Bohm, saying, "Where is Timian, the girl, buried? We want to go pay our respects because we are so in sympathy with her." And the book sold more than 1 million copies in its day, and it's one of the best-selling books, German books, in the early 20th century. It's really, it's up there with All Quiet on the Western Front and books by Thomas Mann. But it was typical of Pabst to take a provocative literary text, like he did with Wedekin's Lulu plays, and to make a film out of them in order to critique society. There's a lot of interesting background there, which your fans might want to check out. So
definitely. Was the reason that she kind of promoted that it was, she was just editing this actual manuscript, was that a marketing thing, or was there maybe social pressures involved?
There were social pressures. I mean, there was, they tried to censor the book. There was a stage play made from the book that was censored. When the first film versions came out, they too were censored. And it was attacked by all kinds of, Christian groups, groups that ran reformatories and schools for girls, attacked it because said, "How can you show this kind of thing? This isn't the way it is." and look what the story is told in the book.
Sure.
There's abortion, suicide, it's just prostitution, and it's just like everything, all the evils of the world. But the author was a single woman who was writing about very topical subject matter, and I think this was a protection, a defense mechanism to deflect some of the scorn that she received, was to say, oh, it's not my book. But then she actually wrote a sequel too that was turned into a film later. So the book is too smartly written to be just some naive teenager's diary. There's a lot more structure and whatnot to it. So we know that it's really a novel and it's not a diary.
There you go. It's still that would be a very coy marketing ploy if that's if that was what was going to be. That's pretty smart as well. I would go with that. Be like, yeah.
Well, I don't think that she knew that this would have worked at the time, because this was her big breakout book. She had written a number of novels beforehand, and none of them really took off. And then she published this, and it's like boom. It's selling tens of thousands of copies a month.
Yeah.
Became quite a phenomenon.
Well, thank you, Thomas. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. For those who are interested, who you've listened to a long discussion on Louise Brooks, you can find both Pandora's Box, I believe, and Diary of a Lost Girl on Kino Lorber. They have the DVDs, and I think
Pandora's Box is out there from Criterion.
Okay,
but
Criterion.
It's out of print, unfortunately. Shame on Criterion.
Yeah.
But yeah, Diary of a Lost Girl is available on Kino. For those interested, I did the audio commentary on the recent Kino release. And I also did the audio commentary on the Kino release for Beggars of Life.
Okay.
Yeah, check them out, and check out my website, the Louise Brooks Society. Just Google it; it's there.
And I guess look for your book. Hopefully, it's coming up soon.
Yeah. Well, by the end of the year, Around the World with Louise Brooks.
Well, we'll be looking forward to it.
Okay. Thank you.